So something that has absolutely bothered the hell out of me with every used car I buy is wiring. It seems like wiring is something that a lot of people are A, scared of, B, don't know how to do properly, C, don't know how to make look nice. The list can go on and on. So today I want to show you guys how to install gauges and how to run wires and how to do all the wiring stuff in that aspect. Now, today we're installing 4 different gauges into my Evo 8. We are installing an oil pressure gauge, we're installing a water temperature gauge, we're installing air fuel ratio sensor and gauge, obviously, and lastly a boost gauge, because with an Evo, especially an older one, we don't have like an access port or something like that where we can pull up a lot of those parameters on there, so we have to have these standalone gauges. So today we're gonna run through it all. So let me show you what I have laid out on the table. I'll link all this stuff below, so if you guys are looking to do this, you can make your gauges look minty and beautiful and have everything ran perfect. So this is what I have laid out in front of me right now. This is for the most part everything you're gonna need except for the camshafts. Don't mind those, I just don't have anywhere else to put those right now because my back area is a little bit full. So with this, obviously you're going to need your gauges. You're gonna need all the wiring and all the sensors that it comes with. I recommend you get some of this 3-2-1 dual wall heat shrink. Don't use the cheap garbage stuff that you're gonna find at like AutoZone, O'Reilly's. I'll link the stuff down below. The dual wall heat shrink has an adhesive liner on the inside of it, so 3-to-1 means it's gonna shrink down 3 times the size that it is now. The adhesive liner on the inside is going to help promote like good adhesion, so that way it's not going to come off. You're obviously going to need some butt crimps. I like these ones. They are heat shrinkable, so that way after you crimp them down, you can heat shrink them. You're gonna need gauge pods or a gauge mounting system. I've already got our gauges kind of set up in here. I've got these 3 set up here, and then I've got my AFR gauge inside of my Evo's cluster. The mounting options are going to vary from what gauge setup you use, so do keep that in mind. Some of them may use these little like crimpy tie down type dealios. Other ones may use the rubber band system, kind of like that, where you have a rubber band, you put it around a gauge, and then you shove the gauge in the gauge pod. Typically with gauges, you're going to see 52mm and 60mm. Now, this is something that's optional. I do recommend it. This is just wire sheathing. It makes your gauge wiring look pretty, so that way you don't have just all these wires going absolutely everywhere in your engine bay, and you don't want to start doing a lot of that stuff until you've got the like sensor location figured out where you're going to put it all. Now, aside from like basic tools you'd have, kind of like just like a socket set or wrenches or whatever, some specialty things that you're going to need. You are going to need something to crimp down like butt connectors. These are like a fancy ratcheting style one that I have with the interchangeable jaws. I'll link these down below. This is actually, I don't remember where I got this. If I can find it, I'll put it down there. But essentially you can just lay your wires inside of these 3D printed guys, solder, or do whatever you got to do. I don't typically recommend using solder on gauge wiring or any automotive wiring if you can avoid it, because solder will break down over time. It'll crack. It's just not the best option. What is the Teflon tape is suggested for things like where's the boost gauge, like boost gauge wiring or boost gauge sensors, things like that. Anything that's pretty much MPT. A pair of dikes, wire strippers. I like these ones a lot easier to use those than any like weird ones. A heat gun for the heat shrink and the butt connectors, and then lastly like an assorted grommet set. And then we are going to need something that I have to go pick up at the auto parts store here in a little bit, which is an add-a-fuse. So there's a couple ways you can wire in like power and ground. I'll typically use a chassis ground point. For power, I don't like hard wiring my gauges into like the stock wiring or anything like that, because when you start to do that, you end up with things like this. These are old engine harnesses, body harnesses from an Evo that have just been like rat screwed from people like cutting off things, wiring in other stuff, and it just ruins the harnesses. So I try to avoid that as much as possible. I've already had to replace harnesses in this car. I don't want to cut up any more of them anywhere where I can avoid it. So an add-a-fuse is essentially something that will tap into your fuse box right up there, and it'll pull power from the fuse box, and you'll obviously add a fuse into this add-a-fuse, and I'll go into this into a little bit more detail here in a little bit. As you can see, I've got my AFR gauge already mounted up in my cluster up here. I've got the wires for it already ran down by my feet, so that way we can run those. Now, before you start like just slapping in gauge wiring and all that stuff, you are going to try to want to locate a firewall grommet to be able to get wiring into your engine bay. Don't be the type of person that runs your wiring out through the door, through the fender, into the engine bay. Find a good firewall grommet. We've got one down here if we wanted to use that one. Alright, I've got all of our sensor wires coming through the firewall. If you're gonna do it, just go through the OEM grommet. Don't try drilling any holes or anything like that. All of our sensor wires are now through here. So we've got AFR, boost, oil pressure, and coolant temp. Now before we start running any of these wires, we need to know the wire length inside of the car. So we're gonna jump inside of the car, start running some more of these wires inside of the car, so that way we can determine the length of which we have to work with out here. Because that's really gonna determine how you run your wires in the engine bay. You don't wanna run all the engine bay wires and find out you're short on wire on the inside of the car. So let's jump in there and start knocking more stuff out. I hope I make some room in here. All right, so now that we're inside of the car, we have all of our wires right here that are coming through the firewall. So my gauges sit right up here, so I need to ensure that I've got enough wire here to be able to run these up behind the radio into our gauges. So we're gonna go ahead and start running these wires up through here. Now, normally these wires can really only plug into one spot. I've already got the wideband one plugged in because it's obviously in the cluster. So in order to get that one in there, kind of had to do that prior. Plus, you want to try to run them behind like kick panels or things you're not gonna see. That way, it's all ran nice and clean. And once we have these plugged in, we can pull some of the excess through later. Like on this boost one, we have like a lot of excess up here. We can take that wire, kind of run it over there because it's going to go that way. Some of the sensor wires we may have to cut and extend. And if that's the case, it's not a huge deal. It's a little bit annoying to do, but really not too bad. There are all of our wires right there. Now we can take our gauges. We'll plug them in from left to right, right to left, however you feel like plugging them in. Son of a pooper. Okay, water temp and oil pressure look strikingly similar, but I know that the sensor on water temp is black and green, so I know that one can go to water temp. Now we've got all of our gauges plugged in right here. Before we go ahead and set this guy in, I'm gonna take all the ones that need to be wired into power and just kind of push them over to the driver's side, because that's where we're gonna be pulling power from, is over there. Grab this guy, pull some of these a little bit taut just to find out what goes where. The big thing here is you really wanna determine wire length from the gauge first, and then figure out where all of your excess and all of your slack is. And then kind of go from there. So now that we've got all of that there, we can go ahead and take this guy, kind of get him in place, push it back in, get the two screws in there. So now we've got all the wires plugged into the gauges right here. So now we've got our gauges mounted. We've got wires started to be ran. So all the wires over here that are now on the driver's side are going to be power ground for the gauges to power up. All the ones in the engine bay are going to be signal. So I can go ahead back up into the engine bay now, grab all of the signal wires for the sensors and kind of pull them a little bit taut, and that's going to tell us how much length we have to work with on these wires. But gauges look good mounted up. They feel sturdy. They don't feel like they're going to go anywhere. It's nice not to have a massive hole in my dash anymore. Now I feel like this next part is where a lot of people get hung up. We're gonna hold off on the power and ground stuff until I've gone to the auto parts store to grab the ADA fuses. But sensors, so we're gonna start getting our sensors in here. Now AFR, oil pressure, and boost gauge sensors. So with the, I already have the coolant temperature sensor, and with these, a lot of people get freaked out because they're like, hey, I don't know where to put these sensors. Obviously it's going to be different on every single engine, but because some of these sensors are a little bit farther, or you don't have enough wire to be able to reach where exactly you want to put them, sometimes we do need to extend out some of these sensor wires, because as you can see, some of them are definitely longer than others. Like the AFR sensor goes all the way down there. So I say we start with the easiest. Let's do the AFR sensor first, and then we'll go to coolant temp, which I already have put into my radiator right there. Then we'll jump over to boost, and then oil pressure, because the oil pressure one is going to be the one that's going to be a little bit funky for us. So let's get AFR in here, and then we'll continue around doing all of our sensor wires, and I'll kind of show you guys how I route them, and any of them that we need to modify, I'll show you how we modify them. So I've got most of the sensors put in except for the oil pressure sensor, mainly because I don't know where I want to put that one quite yet. I'm thinking off the head, but I also don't want to overheat the sensor from the exhaust manifold right there, so I might go off of another galley port. But we have our wideband sensor hanging out right there. We have our coolant temp sensor here, and then the boost gauge sensor is going to go right there. It's not going to be zip tied on there. I just have to go to the store and grab some P-clips when we grab the ADA fuses, but it is going to mount that back there on the firewall. And then all right, so for gauge references, your boost gauge, you're going to want to go to the intake manifold because that's going to see vacuum and positive pressure from the turbo. Your AFR sensor, if you're on like a Subaru like this, there's no downpipe on that car. If you're on a Subaru like mine, your AFR sensor is going to go on the downpipe right after the turbo. On the Evo over here, it goes right back on the bottom of the downpipe right there. So your AFR sensor is definitely going to vary for whatever car that you have. So with those three sensors, we're going to start running wiring. Now I think we should be good for all of them except for the coolant temperature sensor. So what I'm gonna have to do here is cut this somewhere. I want to leave enough slack. I'm gonna cut this somewhere, probably closer to the firewall so I can run some sheathing over it, and extend that out because I want to run this away from any hot parts. You don't want to have your wires resting on like your exhaust, your engine, if you can avoid it. Try to get them away from hot areas. So with the exhaust manifold being right up on top with the Evo, I don't want to run that wire coming like straight across the manifold here. I'm probably going to wrap it around the back and then come up through here above the intake to go to our coolant temp sensor there. So let me start running some of these wires. We'll get things figured out where we want them to go, and I'll give you guys kind of like a rundown of how I decided to run mine. But I wanted to kind of show you guys this here. So I've got my coolant gauge wiring, or my coolant temp sensor wiring right here. It's already been cut. I've already cut it on the other end, and I've already extended it. As you guys can see, I've got the crimps. Now with the crimps, you do want to try to offset them a little bit like this. So if you pull the wires taut, you can see that they're offset. That's just going to make life a little bit easier for us when we go to put sheathing on here. So that way we don't have one big bulge of two of these right next to each other. So I'm going to go ahead and cut one of the wires down on the other side, which I think I will do the ground just to offset them a little bit. We're going to come in here with our wire strippers. This is why I like these ones. They just make life so freaking easy. So now that we've got our ground cut, we can go ahead and come in here and strip the wire, which of course is not a whole lot of room because I cut this real deep in here for some reason. Now we'll grab our crimps. So I like to try to grab the wire first. I like to give it a couple twists. Grab these guys and try to finagle them in here now. Give the old squeeze job, and we've got one on there. Now we can take our other part of the harness here and grab our ground, strip that, and stick it in there. Ooh, I almost forgot an important step. Before we crimp this, go ahead and take my heat sleeve and slide it over these two wires here. This would have sucked because then I would have had to cut it and redo this. So before we crimp it down, we're going to take our heat sleeve, slide it down and over these two wires here that we have already crimped. Slide that down to our sensor, and then I cut a piece of this sheathing somewhere and just kind of scorch the ends. That'll melt this a little bit so that way it'll help from fraying. Now I'm going to slide this down the big bundle of wires going to the sensor. So now that we've kind of made it to the other end of the sensor here, I wish I could take this sensor out, but I'm going to be honest, I don't know how to. I think there's a little tab in there I think I can get. We'll slide the heat sleeve over the sheathing, and then we're gonna push this sheathing down to the base of the sensor, pull it back just a little bit to expose some wire, boop, and then slide that sheathing all the way down. Now we're gonna grab our heat gun, like so. We'll take the other end and push the wire all the way down. Now I've already got heat sleeve slid over on the other side, so what we're gonna do with this, just slide it all the way down so that way our wire's exposed, so that way we can go ahead and crimp these two ends onto the other side, and then we can bring the sheathing all the way down. At this point we have all of our sensors plugged in and they're all ran for wiring. Now the only one I don't have done is oil pressure, and that's because I'm going to wait to do oil pressure until probably like next week or something, or a couple days. I bought a remote mount oil pressure sensor like kit. It's essentially just a fitting in a line that'll go off of right here, comes out 90s, and it'll move my pressure sensor away from the engine. I've killed too many oil pressure sensors by mounting sensors directly to the engine from engine vibration and heat, so I want to try to get the sensors away from all the hot stuff as much as possible, and as much like away from things that vibrate, because that will kill sensors very quickly. Hence why our boost pressure sensor is going to be mounted on the firewall back there. I just have to go get that clip like I was saying. Our coolant sensor is obviously mounted to the radiator. It's not on the engine. It's not on anything like that. And then our AFR sensor is actually down on the downpipe. So none of our sensors are directly mounted to the engine, which is what I wanted to avoid, which is good. Same with our oil pressure sensor. I'll probably mount that back there on the firewall as well. Just run that wire back there. So all of our wiring is pretty much cleaned up. I pushed all the excess back through the firewall down there for what we're not using for coolant temp AFR and that boost. So what I'm going to do next is come over here into the cabin and zip tie up all the wire or all the spare wire down there that we're not using up and underneath of the floorboard. Now if you really want to go the extra mile, you can go ahead and cut out the wire that you're not using, crimp it back together and shove it out of the way. I don't mind zip tying them and just shoving them up out of the way where you're never going to see them. So let me get all those zip tied up and then we'll jump over there to the power side, and then after we get power and ground, all of our gauges should work. Now we're ready to start running the power wires down here over to our fuse box with our out of fuse that I'm about to go get. But before that, if you have any questions on wiring, do look at the wiring diagram. It's pretty easy. There's only 4 wires. You got black, which is your ground, red, which is your switch 12 volt, blue, which is your RS232, which I'm not quite sure what that is. I think that goes to the ECM if you want. Yeah, blue and white are to the ECM if you wanted to wire this into like an ECU or a stock ECU or something like that. So for us, right now we're only going to be worrying about the white or the red and black ones out of all of these. So we've got them here. Now, before you start cutting wire harnesses, I'm going to cut all these shorter because I don't have a need for all of these to be like 200 feet long. I am going to like pull them a little bit tight, bring them over to the fuse box where I'm going to end up plugging them in, and then I'm probably going to leave about, I don't know, a couple inches off of that so that way I can maneuver them around. Now, you don't want to just go cutting this because there is a ground wire in here that we need. So what we're going to do is cut the sheathing on all of these so that way we can pull out the black ground wire, cut off the wires we don't need, and then get rid of the excess sheathing. Grab all of these guys, bring them all up to about right here. There we go, just like that. And then we can go ahead, pull the sheathing off, and then there's our wires. So the ones we're not going to be using are blue and white. I am going to leave a little bit of excess on those in case I ever do need to wire them in. I can go ahead and do so. So we'll take the scrap wire, put it right there, and we'll just let that kind of chill. Now I can go ahead and grab these other ones and kind of measure out the length for where they're going to need cut as well. So that way we can start pulling the rest of the sheathing off. Go, sheathing's been cut. Like I said, it doesn't hurt to reference the diagram before you start cutting wires. So on those ones, we have red, black, white, brown, green, and white. So the green and white would be for AEM. So the white and brown are analog in and out, which we don't need. So we just need black and red off of all of these, which is easy. So this blue and white one right here, we're gonna go ahead and trim that one back a little bit, whoop, to right there. Right here, we just need black and red, so we'll take the white and the brown, trim that one back to right there. Now you've got all of your guys right here with all the powers and all the grounds. Now, we're gonna take all of the black wires though, all of the grounds, and we are gonna put those in one centralized ground and ground those to the chassis. So let me dig through my wiring stuff and see if I have any ring terminals that we can use. All right, so I got my ring terminal. Like I said, now have like a generalized wire path for where you want this to go. Now that I know they're not going to be tangled up, anything like that, I can go ahead and start grabbing all of the black wires. Like I said, I like turning all my stuff into a centralized harness versus having wires go literally everywhere because that gets, it looks crap. Like, don't get me wrong, everyone wires stuff differently, but it just looks way worse to have wires going literally everywhere. The whole reason I wanted to do this way is so that way I can measure out how far I need to make this harness go to reach the grounding point, which for us is right up here on the side of the firewall. There's a centralized grounding point right there. We've got our heat shrink slid down right there. We've got our other piece of heat shrink up here, so that way we can double shrink them down into an actual harness. So now we can measure wire length for where we're going to go, cut the wires, get our sleeve over them, get the heat sleeve over them, and then get it permanently grounded. Then all we have to do is add the power wires to the fuse box. And that's where that's going to sit. We'll take our sleeve, kind of measure it. Normally I go about halfway down the heat shrink. We'll come down to the end of the wire, which is about right there. Get the heat shrink put into, or get the sleeving put into the heat shrink, slide it down. Now before you go to like strip all these and put our ring terminal on there, you need to get another piece of heat shrink and put that on first. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get it over a ring terminal. It's just not going to happen, unfortunately. But this is how OE manufacturers do it, is they utilize anything that needs a ground for a centralized point into one main grounding harness. So that way, it's a lot easier and a lot cleaner of a harness. Slide our ring terminal over all of them. Are our grounds for our gauges, and that'll just ground to the chassis with everything else. Now we just have the power side to worry about, so we're going to do kind of the same thing here, because yeah, this piece of heat sleeve that I have up here will come down and it'll sleeve all that together. All we have left are our 12 volt switch, or switch 12 volt, and our ground that we just have to hook up. So let me run to the auto parts store, grab 2 addifuses for these, and then we can get our gauges working. And then that's pretty much your gauge install, you guys. Really not too bad. It's kind of annoying, but it's not too bad. All right, you guys, it's the next day, so we're gonna go ahead and wrap this up. AutoZone didn't have any addifuses, so I had to buy some on Amazon. Much cheaper on Amazon, you get way more of them, so I'll link these down below. These are addifuses, so this will go into the fuse box. You'll take the fuse out of the fuse box, put it in here, you'll put your additional fuse in there for the gauges. So we're gonna be using 2. We're gonna do 2 gauges off of each. I just don't wanna run 4 gauges onto 1 addifuse. Just asking for trouble later on. So we're gonna do kind of the same thing that we did yesterday. We're gonna take our heat sleeve here and slide it down all the wires. Now when it comes to picking a fuse that you want to tap into, you want something that's a switch 12 volt source, something that's going to turn on when you turn the key. Now, you don't want to tap into anything like crazy important. Like one of them is a radio we'll tap into, the other one is cigarette lighter, so we'll tap into both of those because those are kind of non-essential things. So that is going to be a 10 amp in position. I just got done drilling out the fuel pump studs for this car, and it kind of sucked a lot, so you know, that was fun. Oh, so we've got power and ground applied to those now. Let me go connect up the battery, and we'll test to see if our gauges work, which they should. No reason they shouldn't. So you guys, in a series of annoying events, 2 of my gauges are bad. I'm here with the multimeter. They've got power, they've got ground. Like if I come up here to the wire harness and I go like that, if you look at it while I'm holding it, it's getting its switch 12 volt power on the water temp gauge and on the boost gauge, because both of them aren't working. So as you can see, they both get switch 12 volt and they both get their grounds. We got 0 volts there on that ground, and then on this ground here we get 0 volts, and then when I go back to 12 volts. So the only logical thing that I can think of is that these 2 gauges, these are brand new gauges too, brand new water temp, brand new oil temp, or brand new boost gauge. Neither of them are working. So like if I come right here and I plug it in, I'm actually quite annoyed. Plugged in, nothing. If I come right here and I plug in the boost gauge, nothing. But if you look, the oil pressure sensor gauge works, and so does the air fuel ratio gauge. So it's a little bit of an anticlimactic ending for showing you guys how to wire in gauges properly, and I got 2 bad gauges. So I'll email AEM, get 2 replacements for them. But on the bright side, our air fuel ratio gauge works right there, and so does oil pressure, as they should. So should these 2, but for some reason, they just don't, they're not reading. I don't know why. So I'll shoot AEM an email and see what the hell's going on there. So I actually just got off the phone with AEM about returning these 2 gauges or exchanging them. They said they didn't even want them back. I sent them my proof of purchase. Now they want me to destroy these. So we're gonna have a little bit of fun real quick. So let's destroy the bad gauges, and then they'll send me the new ones and we'll get those in. Because I know the harness is good. We verified that the harness gets power, so let's destroy some gauges. Now he said I could do this in a creative way, so I'll drop something over there. Okay, well there's one. I lost the boost gauge. I think it like shot under the, it went somewhere. That one's good. There's no hiding from us, you gauge. Wow, dude, that thing is like beefy. Oh my god, quit running away. Do motherboards catch on fire? Well, they definitely don't. Oh god, they definitely don't smell good. Oh god. Oh, stop. Okay, well, yep. I'd say those are destroyed now. So that's all I've got for you guys on this one. What a very anticlimactic ending for gauges. So, that sucks that 2 of them didn't work. I know we verified the harness is good. We got 12 volts out of the harness. So, that's all I got for you guys on this one. If the video helped you, go ahead and hit that like button, turn it black, blue, green, yellow, purple, silver sign, whatever color it turns for you. And you're experiencing the same gauge problem I had where 2 of them don't work, but you verified the harness is good and you know your wiring's solid. Call the gauge manufacturer. They'll get you taken care of, hopefully. AEM was pretty good about it. So, sick! With that, if you guys aren't subscribed already and you want to be one of these corners, no idea which one I'll put it in quite yet, but with that, I will catch you guys in the next video. So peace out, homies.